Consider, if you will, the nature of power itself. Throughout human history, dominion has rested with those who commanded forces beyond the reach of ordinary men. The chariot, the warship, the castle wall. But imagine possessing something far more magnificent, creatures of legend made flesh, breathing fire hot enough to melt stone, capable of crossing vast distances in hours rather than weeks. This was the singular advantage of House Targaryen when they arrived on the shores of Westeros 3 centuries before our story begins. They came from doomed Valyria with dragons, and that changed everything. The Targaryens were not the mightiest house in numbers. They were not the wealthiest in gold. They commanded no vast armies of foot soldiers when Aegon the Conqueror looked upon the fractured kingdoms of Westeros. What they possessed was something far more profound: 3 adult dragons and the knowledge to command them. Balerion the Black Dread, whose shadow could engulf entire towns. Vhagar, already ancient and terrible. Meraxes, swift and deadly. With these 3 creatures, Aegon Targaryen would forge 7 independent kingdoms into one realm. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether dragons made this possible, that much is obvious, but rather how the Targaryens transformed raw power into lasting dynasty. Power without strategy is merely destruction. Aegon understood this fundamental truth. When he landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, he did not immediately unleash dragonfire upon every castle that refused him. Instead, he offered terms. Bend the knee, keep your lands, keep your titles, swear fealty to the Iron Throne. It was a calculated generosity, this mercy. Why reduce every stronghold to ash when you could have those strongholds defending your realm instead? The dragon made the threat absolute, but Aegon's diplomatic instinct made the conquest achievable. Consider the alternative: a smoking wasteland of a kingdom requiring decades to rebuild, creating martyrs and legends that would fuel resistance for generations. No, Aegon was too clever for that. But there came a moment when demonstration became necessary. The Field of Fire. Even the name evokes what happened there. King Mern of the Reach and King Loren of the Rock had assembled the largest army Westeros had ever seen, 60,000 men, perhaps more, marching beneath their combined banners. They believed numbers would prevail. They were wrong. Aegon waited until the armies were committed, until retreat was impossible, and then he struck with all 3 dragons simultaneously. The earth itself seemed to burn. Knights in armor became funeral pyres. Bannermen scattered like leaves before a hurricane of flame. 4,000 men died in minutes. The smell of burning flesh carried for miles. This was the calculated use of terror as a tool of conquest. Aegon could have defeated that army through prolonged campaign, through siege and maneuver. But such methods take time, cost resources, create opportunities for reversal. The Field of Fire sent a message that echoed across every castle in Westeros. Resistance meant annihilation. After that day, the submissions came swiftly. The North bent the knee. The Vale bent the knee. The Stormlands bent the knee. Even Dorne, unconquerable Dorne, recognized that something new had arrived in the world, something that changed the fundamental calculus of warfare. But observe what happened next, for this reveals the true genius of Aegon's strategy. He allowed the defeated kings to keep their ancestral seats as lords paramount. The king who knelt in the north remained Warden of the North, ruling in the Targaryen name. The Storm King's heir held Storm's End. This was unprecedented mercy for that brutal age, and it was utterly pragmatic. Aegon understood that he lacked the administrative apparatus to govern 7 kingdoms directly. He needed the existing power structures intact, redirected toward a new center. The regional lords knew their lands, commanded the loyalty of lesser houses, understood the intricate web of marriages and feuds and alliances that made their regions function. Why replace this system when you could co-opt it? The Iron Throne itself became the physical manifestation of this calculated power. Aegon had it forged from the swords of his defeated enemies, twisted and melted by dragon fire into a monumental seat bristling with 1,000 blades. It was deliberately uncomfortable, deliberately threatening. Every king who sat upon it would feel those edges, those points, that danger. It was a reminder power is not comfortable, rule is not safe. The throne is made from the weapons of those who challenged you. As symbol and as political tool, the Iron Throne proclaimed both victory and vigilance. Look upon it and remember what defiance costs. Look upon it and remember why submission was wise. The Targaryens maintained their control through the next century, not merely through the continued threat of dragons, though that remained paramount, but through careful political architecture. They built administrative systems, the small council, to manage the realm's daily governance, the Kingsguard to protect the royal family, the appointment of hands to serve as chief executive. They regularized taxation, codified laws, improved roads and harbors. The dragons gave them the power to rule, but institution building gave them the capacity to rule well, or well enough, at any rate, to maintain stability across a territory larger than any kingdom that had come before. And then there was the matter of succession. Here the Targaryens faced a unique problem. They believed, with considerable evidence, that their ability to command dragons came from their Valyrian bloodline. The dragon-riding families of old Valyria had practiced incestuous marriage to preserve whatever mysterious quality enabled their bond with these magnificent creatures. Brother married sister, uncle married niece, cousin married cousin. For the Targaryens, this was not merely tradition, it was potentially existential necessity. Lose the blood bond with dragons, and they became merely another noble house, with impressive ancestry and delusions of superiority. But Westeros was not Valyria. The faith of the Seven, which the majority of their new subjects followed, condemned such marriages as abomination. The early Targaryens faced genuine religious resistance, uprisings led by militant septons who called for holy war against the incestuous dragon lords. This could have torn the realm apart before the dynasty was properly established. The solution was as politically calculated as the conquest itself: the doctrine of exceptionalism. The faith formally declared that Targaryens, being touched by the divine, being not quite of ordinary humanity due to their dragon bond, were exempt from the normal laws governing marriage. It was a compromise, a political necessity dressed in theological language. The faith received royal patronage and protection. The Targaryens received religious sanction for their peculiar marriage customs. Both sides gained what they needed. This bargain held for generations. Targaryen after Targaryen ascended the Iron Throne, married their siblings, produced dragon-riding heirs. The system seemed stable, the dynasty secure. The dragons themselves became fewer as the decades passed. Not every generation produced as many as the last, and the creatures seemed smaller with each hatching, but there remained enough to maintain Targaryen supremacy. No house dared challenge them directly. Regional conflicts occurred, certainly, but civil war? Unthinkable. The dragons made it unthinkable. And yet, consider what this system lacked. For all their political acumen, for all their administrative reforms, for all their dragons, the Targaryens never properly codified their succession laws. Valyrian tradition, such as it was, followed absolute primogeniture in some families and male preference primogeniture in others. Different dragon-riding houses had different customs, and those customs were lost with Valyria itself. The Targaryens in Westeros developed a fluid approach. The king named his heir, usually the eldest son, and that was that. Simple, clear, except when it wasn't. The Great Council of 101 years after Aegon's conquest seemed to settle the matter. King Jaehaerys, the Old King, after reigning for more than half a century, faced a succession crisis. His sons had died. The choice lay between his granddaughter Rhaenys, daughter of the eldest son, and his grandson Viserys, son of the second son. By strict primogeniture, Rhaenys had the stronger claim she descended from the elder line. But Viserys was male. The lords of Westeros were called to decide. They were not precisely voting for the next king Jaehaerys still lived, but rather establishing a precedent that would govern future successions. The result was overwhelming. The lords chose Viserys by a massive majority. Some argued for male descent. Others feared a queen regnant would be weak. Some feared a queen's husband would hold true power, making the throne vulnerable to ambitious consorts. The arguments varied, but the conclusion was clear when faced with a choice between a female heir from a senior line and a male heir from a junior line. The realm preferred the male. This was now precedent. This was now established principle, or so everyone believed at the time. What seemed a logical decision, a practical solution to an unusual situation, contained within it the seed of catastrophe. For the Great Council of 101 had not actually resolved the underlying question, it had simply made a choice in a specific circumstance. Did this mean that males always inherited before females, regardless of birth order? Did it mean that females could inherit if no male heirs existed? Did it mean that the king's will in naming an heir superseded all precedent? These questions remained unanswered, buried beneath the apparent clarity of the council's decision. The political stability that followed masked these underlying problems. Viserys inherited, reigned peacefully, produced heirs. The realm prospered. Trade expanded. The dragon seed, those common-born folk with enough Targaryen or Valyrian blood to potentially ride dragons, were not yet called upon. The dragons still flew, still inspired awe, still made Targaryen rule seem eternal and inevitable. In the throne room at King's Landing, the Iron Throne reminded petitioners of the cost of defiance. In the Dragon Pit, the roar of dragons reminded everyone of the source of Targaryen power. All seemed well, all seemed stable. But consider the fragility beneath that stability. The Targaryens had built a system dependent on three things: dragons, the king's authority to name his heir, and the assumption that succession would proceed smoothly. What happened when these elements came into conflict? What happened when a king named an heir that precedent contradicted? What happened when there were enough dragons for both sides to field them in conflict? These questions would soon demand answers, and the answers would be written in fire and blood. The dynasty that dragons built stood magnificent and mighty, but it was not invincible. It had never been tested by civil war, never forced to prove whether political structures could survive when dragons fought dragons and Targaryen opposed Targaryen. The Field of Fire had demonstrated what happened when dragons attacked those without dragons. What no one had seen, not in living memory, was what happened when dragon riders made war upon each other. When the power that forged the realm turned inward against itself. This is the foundation upon which our tragedy builds, a dynasty created by overwhelming force, maintained by political calculation, secured by creatures of legend, but vulnerable in ways that would become apparent only when stress-tested by succession crisis. The Targaryens succeeded where others failed because they combined military supremacy with strategic diplomacy. They conquered through terror, but ruled through accommodation. They built institutions while maintaining their mystique. They were dragon lords and administrators, conquerors and politicians, foreigners and kings. Yet for all their achievements, they could not escape the fundamental problem of power it must transfer. Every king dies, every heir must prove themselves, every succession is a potential crisis. The dragons made them mighty. The dragons made them special. But the dragons could not make them immortal, could not guarantee that wisdom would pass from father to son, could not ensure that ambition and principle would never collide in a contest for the throne. The Iron Throne stands in the Red Keep of King's Landing, symbol of Targaryen might, forged by dragonfire from the swords of defeated enemies. Consider it for a moment, that throne shaped by conquest, uncomfortable by design, dangerous in its very construction. It was meant to remind kings of the weight of rule, the cost of power, the necessity of vigilance. Perhaps it should have reminded them of something else, that swords, once melted together, can be reforged anew, that the weapons of old conflicts can become the instruments of new ones. That power concentrated so absolutely, defended so jealously, becomes infinitely valuable to possess and infinitely dangerous to divide. The Dance of the Dragons did not begin with a single decision or a single mistake. It began here, in the foundation itself, in the assumptions built into Targaryen rule from the very beginning. Dragons as the ultimate weapon, royal authority as absolute, succession as something to be managed rather than systematically planned. These were not flaws that would destroy a lesser dynasty. They were flaws that could only destroy a dynasty as powerful as the Targaryens, because only the Targaryens could make war on themselves with such devastating completeness. What follows is the story of how that foundation cracked, how the strategic advantages that made the dynasty possible became the weapons that nearly destroyed it, how the dragons that conquered Westeros became the instruments of Targaryen self-destruction. It is a story of decisions made and unmade, of loyalty tested and broken, of power pursued until it consumed everything worth having. It is a demonstration of a fundamental truth about dominion. The higher you rise, the farther you can fall, and sometimes the fall is not from external threat, but from internal contradiction, finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. The Targaryens had built something magnificent. They had changed the world. They had proven that with sufficient power and sufficient cunning, even the impossible becomes achievable. 7 kingdoms forged into one, centuries of warfare ended by dragonfire, a new order imposed on an ancient land. It was a remarkable achievement, a testament to what can be accomplished when overwhelming military superiority combines with political intelligence. But they had not answered the essential question: what happens when the power that united the realm divides against itself? That question was coming. The answer would be written in fire and blood and ash. And when it was over, nothing would ever be quite the same again. There are moments in history when a single decision reverberates across decades, when one choice, made with the best intentions or the poorest judgment, sets in motion events that cannot be stopped. King Viserys I made such a decision, and understanding it requires us to look at the man himself, kind-hearted, peace-loving, desperately wanting to honor his beloved first wife's memory, and fatally unable to confront the contradiction he was creating. When Queen Aemma died in childbed, along with the son Viserys had hoped would be his heir, the king faced a choice. His brother Daemon was next in line, volatile, dangerous, brilliant, utterly unsuitable in the eyes of the small council. His daughter Rhaenyra was young, intelligent, beloved, and female. In his grief, moved by guilt over his wife's death and love for his daughter, Viserys named Rhaenyra his heir. He gathered the lords of the realm and made them swear oaths to uphold her succession. It was a bold move, a touching gesture, and a political catastrophe waiting to happen. Consider what Viserys had done. He had not changed the precedent set by the Great Council of 101. He had not declared that the realm would now follow absolute primogeniture regardless of gender. He had simply named his daughter heir in the absence of a son. This seemed reasonable enough, but then Viserys remarried. He took Alicent Hightower as his second wife, and she gave him what Aemma could not: sons, Aegon, then Aemond, then Daeron, 3 healthy boys with an unquestionable claim to the throne under the precedent that had put Viserys himself on the throne instead of Rhaenys. Here was the contradiction laid bare. Viserys had a named heir, sworn to by all the great lords. He also had legitimate sons born of a legitimate marriage. Under the precedent of 101, those sons had a stronger claim than any daughter. Under the king's explicit decree, Rhaenyra remained heir. Viserys could have resolved this. He could have formally changed the succession laws, making it clear that his word superseded precedent. He could have acknowledged the traditional claim of his sons, while maintaining Rhaenyra's position through new legislation. He could have called another great council to settle the matter definitively. He did none of these things. Why not? The question haunts us as we examine this tragedy. Perhaps Viserys believed that his word as king was sufficient, that the oath sworn to Rhaenyra would hold despite the changed circumstances. Perhaps he could not bear to hurt his daughter by setting her aside after elevating her so publicly. Perhaps he feared the conflict that explicit clarification would create, hoped that somehow both claims could coexist peacefully. Perhaps he simply lacked the strength of will to make hard decisions. Whatever the reason, Viserys chose inaction. He let the contradiction stand, growing more acute with each passing year. The court at King's Landing began to fracture. These divisions did not emerge overnight, they grew gradually, organically, as people recognized the fundamental uncertainty and positioned themselves accordingly. Around Rhaenyra gathered those who believed in the king's prerogative to name his heir, those who had sworn oaths and felt bound by them, those who saw advantage in supporting the heir apparent. The Velaryons, most prominently Lord Corlys, the sea snake, wealthiest and most powerful lord in the realm after the king himself, had married his daughter Laena to Daemon and would later betroth his granddaughters to Rhaenyra's sons. Their fortunes were tied to Rhaenyra's success. Around Queen Alicent gathered those who believed in traditional succession, those who saw Aegon's claim as legally superior, those who feared the precedent of a ruling queen. Her father, Otto Hightower, the Hand of the King, understood political reality with crystalline clarity. He recognized that when Viserys died, the realm would face a choice between two claimants. He recognized that Rhaenyra, once on the throne, would view Aegon and his brothers as perpetual threats, and rightfully so, for their very existence contradicted her legitimacy. Otto began preparing, slowly and carefully, to ensure his grandson would take the throne. This was not immediate treachery, it was long-term strategy. Otto spent years placing loyal men in key positions. He cultivated relationships with lords who might support Aegon's claim. He ensured that the city watch of King's Landing, critical to controlling the capital, came under the command of Sir Criston Cole, who had his own reasons to oppose Rhaenyra. He built a network, patient and methodical, so that when the moment came, the machinery would be in place to act decisively. This is how power truly operates, not through dramatic gestures, but through careful preparation, through appointments and alliances, and quiet conversations that shape the field of action years before action becomes necessary. The small council itself became a battleground of divided loyalties. Some councillors genuinely supported Rhaenyra's claim, others believed Aegon's was stronger, still others simply tried to remain neutral, to serve the king without taking sides in a dispute that had not yet become open conflict. These shifting alliances created an atmosphere of suspicion and political maneuvering. Who could be trusted? Who was playing both sides? Who was reporting to the queen versus reporting to the heir? The governance of the realm continued, but beneath that surface functionality, the machinery of state was being prepared for opposite purposes. Marriage alliances attempted to bridge these divisions, or perhaps to strengthen factional advantages. It depends on perspective. Rhaenyra married Laenor Velaryon, uniting the heir to the throne with the wealthiest house in the realm. When Laenor died in circumstances that remain mysterious, she married Daemon, bringing the rogue prince firmly into her camp while scandalizing those who saw it as unseemly haste. Her sons were betrothed to Daemon's daughters from his marriage to Laena. These marriages created a united bloc of Targaryen and Velaryon power, with dragons on all sides. It looked formidable. It was formidable. But such alliances also heightened tensions. Every marriage that strengthened Rhaenyra's position made Alicent's faction more anxious about what would happen when Viserys died. The Velaryons were naval powers. They controlled the narrow sea, the trade routes, the wealth that flowed from east to west. Combined with Rhaenyra's dragons and Daemon's military prowess, this alliance could crush opposition, unless that opposition struck first, struck decisively, struck before Rhaenyra could consolidate her position. The strategic importance of dragon riders shifted the calculations fundamentally. In previous successions, whoever controlled the capital and the institutions of power had an enormous advantage. But dragons changed that equation. Rhaenyra and Daemon had dragons. Rhaenyra's sons, regardless of whispers about their true paternity, were dragon riders. The Velaryon girls were dragon riders. This was overwhelming force, except that Alicent's children also had dragons. Aegon rode Sunfire, called the most beautiful dragon ever to fly. Aemond claimed Vhagar, the ancient beast who had helped conquer Westeros, now the largest dragon living. Helaena had Dreamfire. Daeron rode Tessarion. The balance of dragon power was surprisingly even. Imagine the strategic calculations occurring in both camps. Each side assessed their dragon strength, their alliances, their geographic positions, their support among the great houses. Each side believed they had advantages sufficient to prevail. Each side convinced themselves that the other would back down when confronted with their superior position. This is how wars begin, not because one side is overwhelmingly stronger, but because both sides believe they can win. The question of legitimacy became increasingly complex. Rhaenyra could point to her father's explicit decree, to the oaths sworn by every major lord, to the king's unwavering support for her claim. These were not trivial arguments. The king's word was law. Oaths were sacred. To deny her claim was to suggest that sworn vows meant nothing, that the king's authority could be disregarded when convenient. This was genuinely dangerous precedent. If lords could ignore oaths to one heir, what prevented them from ignoring oaths to any ruler they found inconvenient? But Aegon's supporters could point to the precedent of the Great Council, to the same principle that had made Viserys king instead of Rhaenys, to 200 years of unbroken male succession. They could argue that the king's decree had been valid when made in the absence of sons but became void when circumstances changed. They could invoke the practical argument that the realm would accept a king more readily than a queen. These were not frivolous arguments either. Precedent matters, tradition matters. The comfort of the familiar matters when facing fundamental questions about who wields absolute power. Here is the tragedy in its purest form. Both sides had legitimate claims. Neither was simply right or simply wrong. Reasonable people could disagree, and did disagree, about which principle should prevail. In a different realm, this might have been resolved through compromise, through power-sharing arrangements, through clear succession, laws that everyone accepted before the crisis arrived. But the Targaryens were not structured for compromise. The Iron Throne was unitary, absolute. You sat upon it or you did not. There was no mechanism for shared rule, no tradition of division, no path between total victory and total defeat. As Viserys aged, as his health declined, the urgency increased. Everyone knew that his death would trigger the crisis. Everyone knew that both sides were preparing. Yet somehow, impossibly, the king himself seemed to believe that his will would be respected, that the realm would unite behind Rhaenyra as he had decreed. This was not naivety exactly. It was the wishful thinking of a man who desperately wanted peace. who loved both his daughter and his sons, who could not bear to imagine them at war with each other. The dying king's failure to make his will absolutely clear was not a single moment but a sustained refusal across years. He had opportunities. When his sons were born, he could have formally reaffirmed Rhaenyra's status and explained how this overrode precedent. When tensions between the factions became obvious, he could have called all parties together and imposed a settlement. In his final years, he could have made his wishes so explicit, so public, so undeniable that no one could claim confusion about his intent. Instead, he let ambiguity persist. He let both sides continue believing what they wanted to believe. And then, at the worst possible moment, with the realm balanced on a knife's edge, with both factions prepared for confrontation, with dragon riders on both sides ready to fight, King Viserys I died in his sleep. He died with the succession unresolved. He died with two claimants who could not both be accommodated. He died leaving behind a contradiction that only war could resolve. The political vacuum created by his death was absolute. There was no longer a king whose authority could impose a solution. There was no longer a father whose love for his children might restrain them. There was only the raw competition for power, two camps with opposed interests, and the knowledge that whoever acted first would have enormous advantages. The throne was empty. The realm waited, and in that waiting, in those critical hours, after Viserys breathed his last, the fate of the dynasty hung suspended. Consider the terrible simplicity of the situation. Rhaenyra was at Dragonstone, the ancient seat of Targaryen power, but isolated from the capital. Alicent was in King's Landing with her children, at the centre of government, controlling the institutions of state. Rhaenyra had her father's explicit decree and sacred oaths. Aegon had precedent and traditional law. Rhaenyra had powerful allies and dragon riders. Aegon's faction controlled the capital and the treasury. The balance was so perfect, so exact, that neither side could simply overawe the other. They would have to fight. This is what Viserys's kindness and indecision had wrought. Not peace, which he desperately sought, but war, which he desperately feared. By refusing to resolve the contradiction in his own succession, by trying to honour both his daughter and traditional law, by hoping that love and loyalty would somehow transcend political reality, he had created the conditions for catastrophe. His children would wage war for the throne. His grandchildren would die in that war. His dragons would kill each other. His dynasty would be crippled, all because he could not or would not make the hard choice that might have prevented it. The succession crisis that erupted upon his death was not inevitable from the moment of his first marriage or the birth of his children. It became inevitable through the accumulation of decisions unmade, contradictions unresolved, hard truths unacknowledged. It became inevitable because Viserys created a situation where two claims to the throne were both valid and mutually exclusive, where neither claimant could safely yield to the other, where the only path forward was through conflict. This is perhaps the most painful aspect of the tragedy to come. It could have been avoided. Not easily, not without cost, but avoided nonetheless. A clear succession law, a great council called in time, an explicit, undeniable statement of intent. Any of these might have worked. Instead, the realm received ambiguity. An ambiguity in questions of power is simply another word for war, deferred until the moment it can no longer be prevented. The king was dead. The throne was empty. Two claimants prepared their cases. Two factions prepared for conflict. Two sets of dragon riders looked to the skies and contemplated what had never been seen in living memory. Dragons fighting dragons, Targaryen making war on Targaryen, the power that had forged the realm turned inward in fratricidal fury. The foundation had been laid in Aegon the Conqueror's time. The crack in that foundation had opened with the Great Council of 101. The crisis had been created by Viserys's poor decisions and poorer non-decisions. Now the structure would be tested. Now we would learn whether a dynasty built by dragons could survive a war of dragons. Now the dance would begin. In the hours after King Viserys drew his last breath, a remarkable thing happened. Nothing. The king's death was not announced. The bells of King's Landing did not toll. The realm was not informed that the throne had passed. Instead, a handful of men gathered in secret council to decide the future of Westeros. This was the Green Council, named for the colour Queen Alicent wore to signal her faction's readiness, and what they accomplished in those hidden hours would shape everything that followed. Understand the strategic brilliance of this moment. The Green's Alicent, her father Otto Hightower restored as Hand, Criston Cole, commander of the Kingsguard, the Grand Maester, the Master of Coin, the Master of Laws, faced a fundamental problem. Rhaenyra was the named heir. Most lords had sworn oaths to her. She had dragons and powerful allies. In any fair contest, any open succession, she held enormous advantages. So the Greens did not allow a fair contest. They struck first, struck fast, and struck with such completeness that by the time Rhaenyra learned her father was dead, the game had already been played and lost. Consider their justification, for it reveals how power actually operates beneath the surface of legitimacy. They claimed that Viserys, on his deathbed, had changed his mind and named Aegon his heir. Perhaps he had the king was delirious with pain and milk of the poppy, speaking of prophecies and dreams. Perhaps he said something that could be interpreted that way. Perhaps Alicent genuinely believed she heard him name their son. Or perhaps this was simply the story that needed to be told, the narrative that would clothe naked power seizure in the robes of lawful succession. We cannot know the truth of that bedchamber conversation, but we can observe that it served its purpose perfectly. The Green Council moved with precision. First, secure the Red Keep itself, every gate, every entrance, every possible escape route. Second, identify everyone in the castle and assess their loyalty. Those who would support Aegon were brought into the conspiracy. Those who might oppose were quietly detained. Princess Rhaenys, the queen who never was, grandmother to Rhaenyra's children, found herself a prisoner in her own chambers. The planning had been meticulous. Every contingency had been considered. This was not improvisation, this was the execution of a plan, years in the making. Third, control the capital. Sir Criston Cole commanded the Kingsguard, but the City Watch numbered 2,000 men, and its loyalty was uncertain. That uncertainty was resolved through the leadership of Sir Otto Hightower, who had spent years ensuring that key positions went to men who would support the Hightower cause. The Gold Cloaks, as the City Watch was known for their golden-coloured cloaks, fell in line. The gates of King's Landing closed. No one entered. No one left. The greatest city in Westeros became a sealed vessel, cut off from the outside world, while the Greens consolidated power. Fourth, secure the treasury. The royal coffers contained the wealth accumulated through years of Viserys's peaceful reign. Gold buys armies, buys loyalty, buys the time needed to establish legitimacy. The Master of Coin was already part of the conspiracy. The treasury was seized without resistance. In a single night, the Greens had claimed the accumulation of decades of taxation and trade. Rhaenyra, when she learned of her father's death, would find that the realm's wealth had already been committed to her brother's cause. Fifth, eliminate potential opposition, not through mass slaughter that would have been politically disastrous, but through careful, targeted action. Lord Beesbury, the aged Master of Coin who protested the coup, died during the Green Council itself. Accounts vary on whether he fell, struck his head, or was pushed, but the result was the same. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, who might have opposed this seizure of power, was removed from his position. Key lords in the capital were approached, offered positions and rewards for supporting Aegon, or quietly secured where they could cause no trouble. The Greens understood that a successful coup requires more than seizing power, it requires neutralizing those who might immediately challenge that seizure. Then came the diplomatic offensive, the propaganda campaign, the construction of legitimacy. Ravens flew to every major house in Westeros, bearing news of the king's death and his deathbed decree naming Aegon heir. Each raven carried a message tailored to its recipient, appeals to tradition, offers of reward, reminders of oaths sworn to the late king that could be interpreted as transferring to his chosen successor. Greens were not simply claiming the throne by force, they were building a legal case, a moral case, a political case for why Aegon's succession was proper and lawful and just. Observe how carefully they framed the narrative. This was not a coup against the rightful heir, it was the restoration of proper succession after an aberration. The late king's decision to name Rhaenyra heir had been understandable when he had no sons, but circumstances had changed. Viserys himself had recognized this at the end, returning to tradition and wisdom. The realm needed a strong king, not a ruling queen, whose legitimacy would always be questioned. Every precedent, every cultural expectation, every practical consideration favored Aegon. They were not rebels. Rhaenyra was the rebel, refusing to acknowledge reality and her brother's superior claim. The coronation itself was staged with remarkable speed. Within days of Viserys' death, Aegon II was crowned in the Dragon Pit before thousands of witnesses. The ceremony was public, magnificent, designed to create fait accompli. The crown was placed upon his head by the High Septon himself, giving divine sanction to the succession. The assembled lords and commons cheered, whether from genuine support, political calculation, or simply being caught up in the moment matters less than the fact that they cheered. The Greens could now claim popular acclaim, religious approval, and the crown itself. These symbols of legitimacy would matter in the struggle to come. But securing King's Landing was only the first move in a larger game. The Greens held the capital, the treasury, the institutional apparatus of royal government. These were immense advantages, yet Westeros was vast, and power in the Seven Kingdoms had always been distributed. The great houses commanded their own armies, held their own lands, maintained their own loyalties. The Greens needed allies beyond the capital, needed to build a coalition that could match or exceed whatever forces Rhaenyra could assemble. The strategic value of different regions became immediately apparent. The Reach was the most populous kingdom, capable of fielding the largest armies. House Hightower was the second most powerful house in the Reach after the Tyrells, and Otto Hightower was the hand of the king. The Reach could be secured for Aegon. The Stormlands, long loyal to the Iron Throne, could likely be brought into the fold, especially with Aegon married to a Baratheon daughter. The Westerlands under the Lannisters were wealthy and powerful, and the Lannisters had reason to support the traditional succession that had always favoured them. These were the core of green strength, the south and west of Westeros. Against this, Rhaenyra could count on different strengths. The north was vast and formidable, if slow to mobilize. Lord Cregan Stark had sworn oaths to Rhaenyra, and northern lords kept their oaths with a fervour that bordered on religious conviction. The Vale was rich and defensible, and its young lord Jane Arryn was a woman who had successfully ruled in her own right. She would see Rhaenyra's cause as her own. The Riverlands occupied the geographic centre of Westeros, and while the Tullys were cautious, Daemon's wife had been a Riverlands lady, and Harrenhal, that massive, cursed fortress, could become a base for Rhaenyra's forces. These were the foundations of black strength, the north, east, and centre of the realm, And then there was naval power. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, commanded the largest fleet in Westeros. His ships controlled the narrow sea, the trade routes that brought wealth from Essos, the coastlines that supplied King's Landing itself. The Velaryons were committed to Rhaenyra, their grandchildren were her heirs, their family's future was bound to hers. This maritime supremacy was an enormous advantage, potentially decisive if Rhaenyra could leverage it properly. The Greens held the capital, but the Blacks could blockade it, starve it, cut it off from supply and reinforcement. Rhaenyra received word of her father's death and her brother's coronation, while at Dragonstone, the ancient island fortress that had been the Targaryen seat before the conquest. Her reaction when the news arrived was physical. The shock of it, the betrayal of it, brought on early labor. She lost the child she was carrying, a daughter she named Visenya after the conqueror's sister. This personal tragedy occurred simultaneous with political catastrophe, and it delayed her response by crucial days. While Rhaenyra recovered from childbirth and grief, while she grappled with the reality that her throne had been stolen, the Greens continued consolidating their position. But Dragonstone itself was no small thing. It was isolated, yes, cut off from the mainland by Blackwater Bay, but it was also supremely defensible, its Valyrian stonework and strategic position making it nearly impregnable. More importantly, it was the home of dragons. Rhaenyra had her own dragon, Syrax. Her sons rode dragons. Daemon rode Caraxes, called the Bloodworm. The Dragonmont, the volcano that dominated Dragonstone, housed other dragons, younger, smaller, but potentially claimable. From this fortress of stone and dragonfire, Rhaenyra could project power across the realm. Her diplomatic campaign began once she recovered. Ravens flew north, east, to every house that had sworn oaths to her. The message was clear: Aegon's coronation was usurpation, a violation of sacred oaths, a theft of the throne that rightfully belonged to her. Those who supported her now would be rewarded. Those who supported the usurper would be remembered as oathbreakers. The lords of Westeros were being forced to choose, and choose quickly, before positions hardened into immovable commitments. Some choice was easy. The North declared for Rhaenyra immediately. Lord Cregan Stark was adamant that oaths sworn would be oaths kept. The Vale declared for her lady. Jane Arryn would support the rightful queen. The Velaryons committed their fleet. Lord Corlys had staked everything on Rhaenyra's succession years ago. These were powerful allies, but they were also distant from the center of power. The North would take months to mobilize fully. The Vale's armies would need time to descend from their mountains. The Velaryon fleet was formidable, but could not take King's Landing alone. Other choices were more complex. The Riverlands were divided, some houses for Rhaenyra, some for Aegon, some trying desperately to remain neutral. The Stormlands leaned toward Aegon, but were not fully committed. Dorne, independent Dorne, watched with amused interest, but showed no inclination to involve itself in Targaryen civil war. The Ironborn, those reavers and raiders, saw opportunity in chaos, but had no loyalty to either claimant. The realm was fragmenting along lines of oath, interest, geography, and ancient grudge. Both sides believed they could win, quickly. The Greens thought that possession of the capital and the symbols of legitimacy would bring the realm to heel. Faced with an established king, crowned and recognized, the lords would accept reality rather than wage war. Rhaenyra would have to yield or face hopeless odds. This was the calculation: strike first, establish facts on the ground, and opposition would collapse. It was not an unreasonable assessment. History provided examples of disputed successions resolved through swift action and political pressure rather than prolonged warfare. The Blacks believed that oaths mattered, that legitimacy was not simply whoever grabbed the crown first, that the realm would honor commitments made to the late king. They believed their dragon advantage would prove decisive: more riders, more experience, more of the creatures that had made Targaryen rule possible. They believed that the Velaryon fleet would strangle King's Landing into submission. They believed that the size of the north, the wealth of the Vale, the strategic position of the Riverlands would overcome the Greens' initial advantages. This too was not unreasonable. They had powerful arguments and powerful forces, but neither side fully appreciated what was about to begin. Neither side understood the implications of dragon fighting dragon. Neither side recognized how thoroughly a civil war would devastate the realm they were fighting to rule. Neither side could see that there are some conflicts where victory and defeat become meaningless categories, where everyone loses regardless of who sits the throne afterward. The pieces were in position. The Greens held the capital, the treasury, the institutional legitimacy of a crowned and anointed king. The Blacks held the oaths, the dragon advantage, the maritime supremacy. The realm was divided. The great houses were choosing sides. The stage was set for war. All that was needed was the spark that would make conflict inevitable, the moment when talking ended and fighting began, the point of no return, where both sides committed fully to resolving their dispute through blood and fire. That moment came at Storm's End, in the Stormlands, during a diplomatic mission that should have been routine. Prince Lucerys Velaryon, Rhaenyra's second son, flew to Storm's End on Dragonback to secure Lord Boros Baratheon's support. Prince Aemon Targaryen, Aegon's younger brother, flew there on the same errand. Two princes, two dragons, both seeking the same allegiance. Lord Boros, uncomfortable with the situation, reminded them that he was not to be fought over under his own roof. Envoys were sacred. No blood would be shed in his hall. Lucerys departed, his mission unsuccessful but his life intact. He flew into a storm, Arrax beneath him, heading back to Dragonstone to report to his mother. Aemond followed on Vhagar, the ancient she-dragon, largest in the world. What happened next remains disputed. Did Aemond intend only to frighten the boy? Did the dragons act on their own instincts, beyond their rider's control? Or was it deliberate murder, calculated assassination of a rival prince? We know only what resulted. Vhagar killed Arrax in the storm-tossed sky. Prince Lucerys fell into Shipbreaker Bay. His body was never recovered. A prince was dead. A son was dead. A dragon was dead. And with those deaths, any possibility of peace died as well. Rhaenyra's grief transformed into implacable fury. She would have her throne, or she would have vengeance, and she would accept no compromise with the people who had killed her child. The Greens, having lost any moral high ground through Aemon's action, however it occurred, doubled down on their position. They could not yield now. Yielding meant acknowledging guilt, inviting retribution, accepting that they had crowned a king through coup and maintained his position through kinslaying. The propaganda war intensified. The Greens claimed Lucerys had attacked first, that Aemond had defended himself, that the whole incident was a tragic accident in a storm. The Blacks called it murder, kinslaying, the most heinous of crimes. They called Aemond the Kinslayer, a title that would follow him forever. They called the Greens usurpers and murderers both, unfit to rule, deserving only death. The competing narratives hardened positions, made compromise impossible, committed both sides to total victory or total defeat. The dance of the dragons had begun, not with armies clashing or dragons burning cities, but with a boy dying in a storm and the terrible certainty that followed this could only end in fire and blood. The careful strategies, the diplomatic maneuvering, the positioning and planning all came down to this essential reality. They were at war. The realm was at war with itself, and the dragons that had conquered Westeros would now tear it apart. War when it finally comes, rarely unfolds as planners envision. The maps in council chambers show clean lines of dot for advance, decisive battles, rational actors making optimal choices. Reality is messier. Armies march through mud, supply lines break down, allies prove unreliable. Individual decisions, made in moments of passion or fear, cascade into strategic disasters. The Dance of the Dragons was no exception. What began as calculated positioning devolved into a fragmentary, brutal conflict that spread across Westeros like wildfire through dry grass. Consider the geography that shaped this war. Westeros is vast thousands of miles from north to south, with mountain ranges, rivers, forests, and coastlines that channel and constrain military movement. The Seven Kingdoms had been unified under Targaryen rule, but they remained distinct regions with their own histories, their own centers of power, their own strategic imperatives. When civil war erupted, it did not create a single front between two massed armies. Instead, it fragmented into regional campaigns, each with its own logic, its own objectives, its own balance of forces. The Riverlands became the critical theatre almost immediately. This was inevitable, given geography. The Riverlands occupy the centre of Westeros, where north meets south and east meets west. Every major road passes through them. Control the Riverlands, and you control movement across the realm. Lose the Riverlands, and your kingdom splits in half, with forces unable to support each other. Both sides recognized this, and both sides moved to secure this crucial territory. Daemon Targaryen took the initiative here, demonstrating the strategic brilliance that made him so formidable despite his volatile nature. He did not attack King's Landing directly that would have been predictable, expected, defended against. Instead, he flew on Caraxes to Harrenhal, that massive ruined fortress in the heart of the Riverlands. Harrenhal was the largest castle in the Seven Kingdoms, built by Harren the Black before Aegon's conquest and melted by dragonfire for his hubris. It was cursed, people said, haunted by those who died in its burning. But it was also strategically invaluable, a defensible position from which to project power throughout the region. Daemon claimed Harrenhal without resistance. The castle's holder recognized futility when a dragon rider demanded entry. From this base, Daemon began the patient work of diplomacy and intimidation that would secure the Riverlands for Rhaenyra. He visited the various river lords, making offers and threats in carefully calibrated proportion. Some houses declared for Rhaenyra out of conviction or oath-keeping. Others were persuaded by Daemon's arguments. Still others recognized that a dragon overhead makes a compelling case for cooperation. Within weeks, the majority of the Riverlands had declared for the Blacks. But not all. The Riverlands were divided by ancient feuds and competing loyalties. Houses that supported the Greens found themselves besieged by their neighbours. Small-scale conflicts erupted as local grudges merged with the larger war. The Riverlands, which should have been Daemon's secure base, became instead a contested region requiring constant military pressure to maintain. This was not the quick consolidation either side had envisioned. It was the beginning of years of grinding conflict. Meanwhile, the Greens pursued their own strategy in the Reach. The Reach was the breadbasket of Westeros, the most populous kingdom capable of fielding enormous armies. The Hightowers were Reachmen, and they moved quickly to secure support from the major houses. But the Reach, like the Riverlands, proved more complex than anticipated. House Tyrell, traditionally the great house of the Reach, was led by a child. The Tyrells declared for Aegon, but their youth and relative weakness meant other houses felt emboldened to make their own choices. Some declared for Rhaenyra, others remained neutral, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The result was another fragmented theatre. The Reach did not unite behind either claimant. Instead, it descended into its own regional civil war, with Reachmen fighting Reachmen, while the broader conflict raged elsewhere. The Greens could draw supplies and some troops from the Reach, but they could not leverage its full potential because so much of that potential was consumed by internal conflict. This pattern would repeat across the realm, every region fractured along factional lines, every kingdom divided against itself. Then came Rook's Rest, and with it the first major dragon battle of the war. Princess Rhaenys, the queen who never was, had escaped from King's Landing during the Green Coup. She had returned to Driftmark, to her Velaryon kin, bringing news of the usurpation. Now she flew on Meleys, the Red Queen, a magnificent dragon in her prime. Rhaenys was older than the young princes, experienced in ways they were not, and she rode to intercept a green force besieging Rook's Rest, a castle loyal to Rhaenyra. The Greens had laid a trap, though whether they expected to catch Rhaenys specifically remains uncertain. King Aegon arrived on Sunfire, eager to prove himself in battle. His brother Aemond came on Vhagar, the ancient giant. 2 dragons against 1, the mathematics seemed clear. But mathematics does not capture the reality of combat, especially aerial combat between creatures of such power and will. The Battle of Rook's Rest was brief and cataclysmic. Meleys fought brilliantly, Rhaenys directing her with skill born of long partnership. She wounded Sunfire grievously, tearing wing and flesh, sending king and dragon plummeting toward the ground. For a moment, it seemed she might prevail despite the odds. But Vhagar was simply too large, too powerful, too ancient to overcome. Aemond drove his mount into Meleys from above, using sheer mass and ferocity. Both dragons fell, locked together, crashing to earth with impact that shook the ground for miles. Meleys died. Rhaenys died, crushed. Beneath her dragon's weight or burned by dragonfire accounts differ on the specifics, but the result was certain. Sunfire survived, barely, crippled and unable to fly. Aegon survived, barely, his body broken, his reign suddenly dependent on others to govern in his name. Vhagar survived, victorious but exhausted. It was a tactical victory for the Greens. They had killed an enemy dragon and rider. But it was also a strategic disaster. They had lost their king's effectiveness, lost the visible symbol of Aegon's martial prowess, revealed that dragon combat was horrifically costly even for the victors. Observe what this battle demonstrated. Dragon against dragon was not like dragon against groundling armies. At the Field of Fire, 3 dragons had killed thousands with impunity, untouchable in the sky. But dragon against dragon meant casualties on both sides. It meant losing the irreplaceable weapons that made Targaryen rule possible. It meant that every victory diminished both sides, eating away at the foundation of their power. Neither faction fully grasped this lesson, or if they did, they could not act on it. They were committed now. The only path was forward, through more battles, more losses, more devastation. The naval war erupted simultaneously across the narrow sea. The Velaryon fleet, commanded by Lord Corlys and his captains, began a blockade of King's Landing. They controlled the seaways, intercepted supply ships, cut off trade from Essos. The Greens, desperate to break this stranglehold, made alliance with the Triarchy, the alliance of free cities, that controlled much of the Stepstones and Eastern Waters. Gold and promises bought Triarchy intervention, bringing their warships north to challenge Velaryon supremacy. The Battle of the Gullet was one of the largest naval engagements in Westerosi history. Hundreds of ships, thousands of men, fighting across miles of open water. The battle raged for days, as wind and tide shifted advantage back and forth. The Triarchy used fire ships, vessels packed with combustibles, and sent burning toward enemy formations. The Velaryons used their superior seamanship and knowledge of local waters. Both sides took horrific casualties as ships burned and sank, and men drowned in armor too heavy to permit swimming. But the decisive factor was dragons. Prince Jacaerys Velaryon flew Vermax into the battle, trying to tip the scales with dragonfire. It was courageous, brilliant, and ultimately fatal. The Triarchy had prepared for dragons. They had arbalests, massive crossbows designed to shoot bolts large enough to pierce dragon scales. They had practiced coordination, focusing fire from multiple ships simultaneously. When Jacaerys attacked, they were ready. Vermax was struck, wounded, fell into the sea. The prince tried to swim, weighed down by armor, and disappeared beneath the waves. The loss of Jacaerys was devastating for multiple reasons. He was Rhaenyra's eldest son, her heir, the prince who would have united the realm after her victory. He was a capable military commander and diplomat. His death was also symbolic. It showed that dragons were vulnerable, that even aerial supremacy had limits, that the weapons the Targaryens depended upon could be countered by sufficiently determined opposition. The Velaryon fleet, despite tactical victories, had lost its most important dragon rider. Control of the sea remained contested. The blockade weakened. King's Landing's supply situation eased. Both sides reeled from these losses but pressed forward. Strategy gave way to something more primal, the need to hurt the enemy, to take vengeance for losses suffered, to prove that sacrifice had meaning through further sacrifice. The rational calculations of the war's opening gave way to escalation, to increasingly desperate measures, to actions that would haunt the survivors long after the fighting stopped. Rhaenyra, on Dragonstone, made a decision that seemed strategically sound but carried terrible implications. She called for Dragonseed's commoners with Targaryen or Valyrian blood, enough perhaps to bond with dragons, to come forward and try to claim the riderless dragons. There were dragons on Dragonstone without riders. There were dragons in the dragon pit at King's Landing that might be liberated. If these dragons could be claimed, the numerical advantage would overwhelm the Greens. It was logical, necessary even, given the losses suffered, but it was also dangerous. Dragons were power itself, the foundation of Targaryen supremacy. Giving that power to base-born men and women, however much Valyrian blood they carried, changed something fundamental. It said that dragon riding was not solely the province of the highborn, that legitimacy could be separated from lineage, that power might flow from capability rather than blood. Some of the dragon seeds who came forward succeeded. Hugh Hammer claimed Vermithor, ancient and huge. Ulf White claimed Silverwing. Nettles, a girl of uncertain parentage, claimed Sheepstealer through patience and persistence. Others died trying, burned or devoured, or simply rejected by dragons who would not accept them. These new dragon riders gave Rhaenyra additional force, but they also introduced instability. The dragon seeds owed their elevation to her, but they had no deep loyalty, no lifetime of shared Targaryen identity. They were mercenaries, essentially, paid in status and power rather than gold. This would matter later, when the war's fortunes shifted and opportunity beckoned elsewhere. With these reinforcements, Rhaenyra moved to strike at the heart of green power. The plan was audacious: take King's Landing itself. The city was defended, certainly, but not against multiple dragons attacking simultaneously. King Aegon was crippled, unable to fight. Aemond and Vhagar were elsewhere, campaigning in the Riverlands. The moment seemed right. Rhaenyra gathered her dragons, her own Syrax, her son Joffrey on Tyraxes, the dragon seeds on their mounts, and flew for the capital. The fall of King's Landing to Rhaenyra's forces was swift and relatively bloodless in its initial phase. The dragons appeared in the sky, and the City Watch, never fully loyal to Aegon, opened the gates. The common people, pragmatic as always, cheered for the new queen. The Greens who could fled Aemond was absent. Alicent and her remaining children sought sanctuary in the Red Keep. The small council scattered. Rhaenyra entered the city in triumph, claimed the Iron Throne that was rightfully hers, and prepared to govern the realm she had fought to win. It should have been victory. It should have been the beginning of her reign, the moment when the legitimacy of force superseded the legitimacy of oaths and tradition. But military victory did not translate to political stability. The realm was devastated by war. The treasury, seized by the Greens months earlier, had been spent on campaigns and bribes. The common people, initially welcoming, quickly soured as Rhaenyra imposed heavy taxes to fund continued military operations. She needed gold to pay armies, to reward allies, to prosecute the war against remaining Green forces. That gold had to come from somewhere, and somewhere meant the people of King's Landing. Worse, Rhaenyra made political mistakes born of paranoia and grief. She arrested and executed people suspected of supporting the Greens. Some were certainly guilty, but others were merely convenient targets, scapegoats for her rage over Lucerys's death and Jacaerys's death and all the losses she had suffered. Fear spread through the capital. The nobility wondered who would be next. The commons wondered how high taxes would rise. The joy of her arrival curdled into resentment. And then came the Dragon Pit, the catastrophe that changed everything. The circumstances remain disputed, but what happened is clear enough. A riot erupted in King's Landing, driven by a combination of tax resentment, religious fanaticism, whipped up by preachers who called dragons abominations, and mob psychology that transformed individual grievances into collective violence. The mob marched on the Dragon Pit, that great domed structure where the royal dragons were housed when in the city. They carried weapons, torches, rage. The dragons in the Dragon Pit Syrax, Joffrey's Tyraxes, others were vulnerable. They were enclosed, constrained by architecture designed to hold them. The keepers fled. The mob broke in. What followed was slaughter on both sides. Dragons burned hundreds, thousands, filling the Dragon Pit with fire and smoke and the screams of the dying. But the mob kept coming, kept attacking with spears and axes and sheer numbers. They killed Tyraxes. Young Prince Joffrey, trying to ride his dragon to safety, fell from the Dragon Pit's height and died. They killed Syrax when Rhaenyra tried to ride to her son's rescue. They killed other dragons, smaller ones, younger ones, trapped in that stone death chamber. The Dragon Pit burned. The dome collapsed. The mob, or what survived of it, dispersed. The dragons, most of the dragons housed in King's Landing, were dead. Rhaenyra had lost her mount, lost another son, lost the visible symbols of her power. The strategic calculus of the entire war had suddenly shifted. The Black's dragon advantage, purchased at such cost with the dragon seeds, had evaporated. The Greens, with Vhagar and a few others surviving elsewhere, suddenly faced even odds or better. This was the turning point, the moment when Rhaenyra's position in King's Landing became untenable. She had military control of the city but not political control of the realm. She had the throne but not the stability to hold it. The common people hated her, the nobles feared her. Her dragons were dead or scattered. The treasury was empty. And out in the realm, Green forces remained intact, now emboldened by the knowledge that the dragon advantage had disappeared. But consider, too, what the Greens had done, the actions they had taken that would poison their own claim to righteousness. Blood and cheese, the names alone evoke horror. Early in the war, after Lucerys's death, Daemon had orchestrated revenge. 2 men, a former Gold Cloak and a rat-catcher, infiltrated the Red Keep. They found Queen Helaena and her children. They gave her a choice straight from Nightmare: which son dies. She begged them to kill her instead, but they refused. They killed her youngest boy while she watched, while her daughter watched, cut off his head and departed with it. It was terror tactics, calculated to inflict maximum psychological damage. Make the Greens feel the loss Rhaenyra felt. Make them understand that their families were vulnerable, that nowhere was safe, that the war had no limits or boundaries. It succeeded in that aim. Helaena never recovered, descending into madness and eventually throwing herself from a window. But it also backfired catastrophically. It made Rhaenyra's side look monstrous. It gave the Greens a genuine grievance, a crime so heinous that it justified any retaliation. It transformed what might have remained a political dispute into something far more primal and unforgivable. Both sides had now crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. Both sides had committed atrocities. Both sides had lost children, lost dragons, lost any possibility of reconciliation. The war ground on, not because anyone believed victory was still possible in any meaningful sense, but because stopping meant acknowledging what had been done, meant facing consequences, meant admitting that all the death and destruction had been for nothing. So they continued. They fought because the alternative was accepting defeat, and defeat meant death or dishonor or both. The strategic errors accumulated. The initial rational calculations secure this region, control that resource, leverage this advantage gave way to reactive violence. Plans fell apart in execution. Allies proved unreliable or treacherous. Dragons died. Cities burned. The small folk suffered as armies marched back and forth across their lands, requisitioning food, burning crops, turning harvest season into a time of dread. This was no longer about who had the better claim to the throne. It was about survival, about vengeance, about the terrible momentum of violence once unleashed. The dance had become what civil wars become when they drag on too long, a self-perpetuating catastrophe, destroying the very thing both sides claimed to be fighting for. The Iron Throne remained, cold and uncomfortable and bristling with 1,000 blades, but the realm it represented was tearing itself apart, and the dragons that had forged that realm were dying one by one in battles that benefited no one. There comes a moment in every protracted conflict when the initial advantages that seemed so decisive prove ephemeral, when the balance of power shifts not through brilliant strategy but through sheer attrition, when both sides realize simultaneously that victory has become indistinguishable from defeat. The Dance of the Dragons reached this point after the Dragon Pit massacre, and what followed was not so much a continuation of strategic competition as a desperate scramble by exhausted factions who no longer remembered why they had started fighting. Consider the strategic situation in the wake of the Dragon Pit catastrophe. For months, the calculus of the war had revolved around dragon power, who had more, who could deploy them most effectively, which side could leverage aerial supremacy into decisive advantage. The Dragon Pit changed that calculus overnight. Suddenly both sides had lost dragons. Suddenly the advantage that had defined Targaryen rule for 3 centuries was slipping away through violence and chaos. The weapons that had conquered Westeros were destroying each other, and neither faction could stop the process they had set in motion. Rhaenyra's position in King's Landing became untenable. She had lost Syrax, her personal mount, her companion of decades. She had lost her son Joffrey, her third boy, watching him fall from the Dragon Pit's height, trying desperately to save his dragon. She had lost control of the capital in any meaningful sense. She occupied the Red Keep and sat the Iron Throne, but the streets belonged to a mob that had demonstrated its capacity for violence against dragons themselves. The common people who had cheered her arrival now cursed her name, blamed her for the deaths in the Dragon Pit, resented the taxes she imposed, feared her paranoid executions. The treasury remained empty despite all those taxes. War is expensive, devastatingly so, and Rhaenyra had been fighting for months with no end in sight. She needed gold to pay armies, to feed the capital, to maintain the loyalty of the soldiers who kept her on the throne. But the gold was not there. The Greens had spent the royal coffers in the war's early months. The Velaryon wealth that might have sustained her was committed to naval operations and the repair of their own losses. The realm was exhausted, tapped out, unable to provide more resources for continued conflict. Rhaenyra made the decision to flee King's Landing, to return to Dragonstone where she might be safe, where she could regroup and plan her next move. It was the right decision, probably the only decision that gave her any chance of survival. But the execution was hasty, desperate, reflective of how thoroughly her position had collapsed. She left in secret, taking only a few loyalists, abandoning the capital she had fought so hard to claim. The Iron Throne sat empty once again. King's Landing found itself without a ruler, occupied by Rhaenyra's forces, but governed by no one in particular. Meanwhile, out in the realm, the war continued with mechanical inevitability. Aemond One-Eye had spent the months since Rook's Rest campaigning in the Riverlands, trying to break Daemon's hold on that crucial region. He rode Vhagar, the last of the Conquest dragons, ancient and vast and terrible. With this mount, Aemond pursued a strategy of scorched earth and intimidation, burning castles of houses that supported Rhaenyra, destroying crops, terrorizing the population, making it clear that resistance carried unbearable costs. It was effective in a narrow tactical sense. Houses that had declared for Rhaenyra reconsidered when Vhagar appeared overhead. Some switched their allegiance, others simply tried to withdraw from the conflict entirely, declaring neutrality and praying to be left alone. The Riverlands, already devastated by months of warfare, suffered further destruction. Fields that should have been feeding the realm turned to ash. Villages emptied as small folk fled the dragon's shadow. The strategic objective controlling the Riverlands was being achieved through methods that rendered the prize nearly worthless. But observe the political cost of this campaign. Every castle burned created new enemies. Every village destroyed produced survivors who would remember, who would hate, who would support anyone who promised to remove the Targaryens from power. Aemond was winning battles while losing the broader struggle for legitimacy and acceptance. He was demonstrating that dragon power, without restraint, without the diplomatic accommodation that Aegon the Conqueror had shown, without any effort to govern justly, created only ruins and resentment. The neutral houses, those who had tried to avoid taking sides, or who had remained on the fence hoping to see which way the war would tip, found themselves targeted by both factions. The Greens burned them for not supporting Aegon. The Blacks raided them for not supporting Rhaenyra. Being neutral meant being victimized by everyone. This had consequences. It meant that when the war finally ended, when some sort of peace was imposed, vast sections of the realm would hate the Targaryens generally, would see both factions as equally destructive, would welcome any alternative to dragon rule. Daemon remained at Harrenhal, that cursed fortress in the heart of the Riverlands, watching and calculating. He was older than Aemond, vastly more experienced, a seasoned warrior and dragon rider who had fought in multiple wars. He rode Caraxes, the Bloodworm, a dragon smaller than Vhagar, but faster, more agile, perfectly suited to Daemon's aggressive fighting style. He had been prosecuting his own campaign, securing loyalty through a combination of charm, intimidation, and strategic violence. But he recognized that the war had reached a critical juncture. The strategic calculation Daemon made was brutal in its simplicity. Aemond and Vhagar represented the Greens' remaining military power. King Aegon was crippled, unable to fight or even to govern effectively. Kill Aemond, kill Vhagar, and the Greens would collapse. They would have no dragons, no military force capable of projecting power across the realm. The Blacks would win by default, regardless of how weak their own position had become. It was a decapitation strategy: remove the head of the snake and the body dies. But executing this strategy required luring Aemond into a confrontation. Aemond was not foolish. He knew that Daemon was dangerous, knew that a fight between them would be uncertain in outcome. He had been avoiding direct engagement, using Vhagar's superior size to attack targets. Daemon could not easily defend, staying mobile, refusing to be pinned down. Daemon needed to create a situation where Aemond would have to fight, where tactical considerations or pride or strategic necessity would force the confrontation. The answer was the God's Eye, that vast lake in the heart of the Riverlands with the Isle of Faces at its centre. Daemon took position at Harrenhal, visible and seemingly vulnerable, daring Aemond to attack. It was a challenge that Aemond, with his pride and his fury and his single eye burning with need to prove himself, could not ignore. He came on Vhagar, vast and powerful, ready to end Daemon once and for all. Daemon rose on Caraxes to meet him, above the God's Eye, where the old gods were said to watch through carved faces on ancient trees. Two of the last great dragons of Westeros prepared to kill each other. The duel above the God's Eye has become legend, embellished in songs and stories until truth and myth become impossible to separate. But the essential facts are known. Caraxes and Vhagar met in the sky above the lake. They clashed with a fury that shook the air itself. Blood fell like rain. Dragon fire turned clouds to steam. For how long they fought, witnesses could not agree. Time becomes meaningless when watching gods make war. But the end was certain. Daemon, in a move that speaks to either desperate courage or suicidal determination, leaped from Caraxes onto Vhagar's back as the dragons grappled. He climbed up the dragon's neck, driving his Valyrian steel sword Dark Sister through Aemond's remaining eye and into his skull. Aemond died instantly, but Vhagar, in her death throes for Caraxes, had torn her throat out, twisted, and fell. Daemon, strapped to the dying dragon's back, or simply unable to escape, fell with her. Both dragons crashed into the God's Eye. Both riders disappeared beneath the waters. Neither body was ever recovered. Contemplate what this meant strategically. The Blacks had lost Daemon, their finest military commander, their most experienced dragon rider, the man who might have unified Rhaenyra's fractured coalition. The Greens had lost Aemond, their military leader, and Vhagar, the last dragon large enough to challenge multiple opponents simultaneously. Both sides had sacrificed their strongest pieces in a mutual kill that benefited neither. It was the logical endpoint of the dragon-on-dragon combat that had defined this war. Both sides diminished, both sides weakened, neither side victorious. The gods of the Isle of Faces, if they watched, must have observed with grim satisfaction or profound sorrow. The Targaryens, who had come to Westeros with dragons and used them to forge a kingdom, were destroying those same dragons in a civil war over who should rule that kingdom. The weapons that had made them great were consuming them. The power they had wielded was turning inward, and the realm that power had created was being torn apart in the process. Back in King's Landing, confusion reigned. Rhaenyra had fled to Dragonstone. Her forces still occupied the capital, but without clear leadership, without a dragon queen to rally around, their position eroded daily. The Green faction, scattered and leaderless with Aegon crippled and Aemond dead, began to reconsolidate. King Aegon himself, broken in body but not in will, was moved secretly from place to place, kept alive and kept hidden, a symbol that the Greens could rally around if they could secure him. The political maneuvering around the captive or hidden king became increasingly complex. Some Green loyalists wanted to return him to King's Landing, to reclaim the capital and restore his rule. Others thought this too dangerous. He was vulnerable, easy to kill, and his death would end any pretense of legitimacy for their cause. Some on the Black side wanted to find him and execute him, ending the war at a stroke. Others worried about the precedent of killing a crowned king, even an enemy king, even a usurper. These were not abstract political questions, they were matters of immediate life and death, of how the realm would be governed and who would govern it. Into this vacuum came Cregan Stark, the Wolf of the North, Lord Stark had spent the entire war mobilizing the North's power, gathering armies, preparing for the march south. The North is vast but sparsely populated, its armies formidable but slow to assemble. By the time Stark was ready to enter the war in force, the war had largely consumed itself. He arrived in the south with a fresh, untouched army, 20,000 men who had not been ground down by months of campaigning, who were well supplied and disciplined, who represented a military force neither the exhausted blacks nor the depleted greens could match. Stark's position was unique. He held military superiority without having invested anything in the conflict that had devastated everyone else. He could dictate terms. He could choose which faction to support or whether to impose his own solution. The lords of the South, who had been fighting and dying for months, suddenly found themselves at the mercy of Northern judgment. It was a remarkable reversal. The peripheral kingdom, the slowest to mobilize, arriving at the critical moment with the power to determine outcomes. The Lannister and Baratheon houses, both of which had supported the Greens, reassessed their positions as the war ground toward its ending. They had committed forces, suffered losses, but not to the degree that the Central Kingdoms had suffered. They could see that continuation of the war served no one's interests. The realm was devastated. The dragons were nearly extinct. Whoever won would inherit a kingdom in ruins, with a nobility that had lost faith in Targaryen rule, with small folk who had been terrorized and taxed into destitution. Better to seek peace, to negotiate some settlement that allowed everyone to claim partial victory and move toward rebuilding. The poisoning of King Aegon II occurred in this context, a strategic decision to end the stalemate by removing one of the two claimants. Who exactly poisoned him remains disputed. Some sources claim it was his own loyalists, recognizing that his crippled state and the continued association with his rule was destroying any chance of peace. Others blame black infiltrators, completing their long campaign to eliminate the rival claimant. Others suggest something more complex, a conspiracy of moderates on both sides who recognized that neither Rhaenyra nor Aegon could ever govern a reunited realm. The king died painfully, crying out that poison was burning his throat, burning his stomach. His death was not noble or heroic, it was squalid and fearful and pathetic. But strategically, it opened possibilities. The Greens' cause did not die with him, but it lost its focus. Without a crowned king to restore to power, what exactly were they fighting for? Aegon had no surviving sons. His male heirs had been killed earlier in the war. His line was broken. The legitimacy the Greens had claimed, based on male primogeniture and precedent, suddenly had no claimant to attach to. The peace negotiations that followed were driven by exhaustion as much as by any diplomatic skill. Both sides had lost too much to continue. The dragons that had defined Targaryen power were mostly dead. The great houses that had supported both factions were bled white, their armies diminished, their treasuries empty, their populations reduced by war and famine. No one had won. Everyone had lost. The question was no longer who deserved the throne, but how to end the fighting before there was nothing left to fight for. The political necessity of peace became overwhelming. The realm needed to function again. Crops needed to be planted. Trade needed to resume. Justice needed to be administered by a government that could claim legitimacy and command respect. The Civil War had demonstrated that dragon power alone could not sustain Targaryen rule if that power was used against itself. New foundations were needed, new compromises, new arrangements that might prevent this catastrophe from recurring. But peace negotiations in the aftermath of such devastation are never simple. Too many people had died, too many atrocities had been committed, too many noble houses had lost heirs and castles and pride. Someone would have to pay for what had happened. Someone would have to be held accountable. The question was who, and how much, and whether any punishment could. satisfy the realm's need for justice, while still allowing the survivors to work together in governance. The Dance of the Dragons had consumed itself. The strategic advantages that both sides had counted on, dragons, alliances, geographic position, naval power, had all been negated through mutual destruction. What remained was not victory but survival, not triumph but trauma, not a clear winner entitled to rule but a realm full of losers trying to figure out how to live with what they had done and what had been done to them. The Iron Throne remained in King's Landing, that uncomfortable seat of melted swords. But who would sit upon it, and with what legitimacy, and commanding what loyalty, were questions that the war had not answered, but only made more complex and more urgent. The fire and blood that had forged the 7 kingdoms into one had turned inward, and no one yet knew what would emerge from the ashes. Peace, when it finally arrived, was not the product of wisdom or goodwill, but of simple exhaustion. The realm had bled itself to the point where continuing the war became physically impossible. Armies had melted away through casualties and desertion. The treasury was beyond empty, it was burdened with debts that would take generations to repay. The dragons, those magnificent creatures that had made Targaryen rule possible, were nearly extinct. What remained were traumatized survivors trying to construct some framework for coexistence from the ruins of their civil war. The man who orchestrated this peace, who imposed order through a combination of justice and political theatre, was Cregan Stark. The Lord of Winterfell had arrived in King's Landing with his northern army at the moment of maximum leverage, when both factions were exhausted, when no one had strength left to resist his will, when his fresh troops represented the only cohesive military force in the south. He proclaimed what came to be called the Hour of the Wolf, and in that hour he demonstrated how peace is made after catastrophic conflict. Justice, Stark understood, was necessary but also dangerous. The realm needed to see that crimes had been punished, that those responsible for the worst atrocities would face consequences. Without this, the peace would feel like a betrayal, like declaring that all the death and suffering had been meaningless. But justice taken too far, punishing too many, would make reconciliation impossible. There would be no one left to govern, no lords to maintain order, no administrative continuity. The Hour of the Wolf required discrimination. Certain people had to die, and others had to be spared, and the decision of who fell into which category was fundamentally political. Some executions were inevitable, those who had committed the most visible atrocities, those whose survival would mock the concept of justice, those who were too dangerous or too hated to be allowed to live. These men faced the headsman's sword. The 2 assassins, who had killed Queen Helaena's son in Blood and Cheese, would have been executed if they could be found. But one had died during the war and the other had vanished. Other scapegoats were located, the perpetrators of particular massacres, the commanders who had ordered the burning of neutral houses, the men who had tortured prisoners or violated the sacred rules of envoys and parley. But observe who was spared. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, who had switched sides multiple times during the war, who had supported first Rhaenyra, then negotiated with the Greens, then returned to the Blacks, survived. His political acumen and his essential role in any future government made him too valuable to execute. His wealth, diminished but still substantial, was needed for rebuilding. His fleet, reduced but still the most powerful in Westeros, was necessary for maintaining trade and security. Justice bent before necessity. Corlys kept his life, kept his titles, kept his influence, because pragmatism demanded it. Other lords who had committed no personal atrocities but had fought loyally for the Greens were given oaths and pardons. They bent the knee to the new order, swore fealty to the new king, and were allowed to return to their lands. This was calculated mercy. These lords commanded the loyalty of their regions, held the castles that controlled strategic positions, governed the small folk who needed governance. Executing them would create chaos, vacuums of power, opportunities for disorder. Better to co-opt them, bind them to the new regime through oaths and strategic marriages, make them stakeholders in the peace. The strategic marriages arranged as part of the peace settlement were masterworks of political calculation. Former enemies were bound together through matrimony, creating ties of kinship that might prevent future conflicts. The great houses were encouraged to intermarry across factional lines, producing children who would carry blood from both blacks and greens, making the division less absolute, less permanent. These marriages were not romantic unions, they were diplomatic treaties, peace bonds made flesh, political arrangements disguised as family building. Consider the brilliance and the coldness of this. Young men and women were wed to former enemies, expected to share beds with people whose families had killed their own families, to produce heirs with those who had fought against their cause. The personal cost of these arrangements was immense. Imagine the wedding nights, the forced intimacies, the raising of children in households built on murder and betrayal. But politically, they worked. They created incentives for cooperation, made future civil war more difficult, bound the realm together through blood ties that might, eventually, become genuine bonds. The most critical political decision was who would sit the Iron Throne. Neither faction could accept the other's preferred candidate. The Greens would never bow to Rhaenyra. After all that had happened, the Blacks would never accept any of Aegon's line after his usurpation and the atrocities committed in his name. The solution was both obvious and ingenious. Crown Aegon III, Rhaenyra's eldest surviving son, by her first marriage to Laenor Velaryon. Young Aegon united both claims. Through his mother, he descended from Rhaenyra, the named heir, the princess who had been robbed of her throne. Through his grandmother, Queen Alicent had been his mother's stepmother, connecting him tenuously to the Green faction. Through his Velaryon blood, he connected to the richest house in the realm. He was young enough to have committed no crimes, to bear no personal responsibility for the war's atrocities. He was also deeply traumatized. He had watched his mother die, watched his brother die, endured horrors that would mark him for life. But trauma, in this context, was almost an asset. He would not seek vengeance. He would not pursue ambitious wars. He would be the broken king, focused on survival and healing rather than conquest or glory. The regency established to govern during Aegon's minority was itself a political compromise. No single faction could dominate. The council included representatives from both former sides, men who had fought for the Blacks and men who had fought for the Greens, bound now by oaths to govern cooperatively. It was an uncomfortable arrangement, a forced marriage of political necessity, but it worked after a fashion. The competing power blocks within the regency checked each other, prevented any one faction from seizing absolute control, ensured that governance required negotiation and compromise. Lord Corlys's political survival deserves closer examination, for it reveals much about how power actually operates. The Sea Snake was 79 years old when the war ended, ancient by the standards of the age, yet still commanding through sheer will and accumulated wisdom. He had made himself indispensable through long years of service, through his wealth and his fleet and his political connections. He had also demonstrated remarkable adaptability, supporting Rhaenyra when she seemed likely to win, negotiating with the Greens when circumstances changed, returning to the Blacks when opportunities arose. Some called this treachery, others called it survival. Corlys himself might have called it realism. His reward for this flexibility was continued power. He served on the Regency Council, advising young Aegon III, helping to govern the realm he had helped tear apart. Was this justice? Not by any conventional measure, but it was pragmatism, and pragmatism is often the only justice that politics allows. Corlys died in his bed a few years later, wealthy and honoured, mourned as a great lord despite his multiple betrayals. This is how the world actually works. The survivors write the history, and the survivors are often those who knew when to switch sides. The economic devastation the war had caused required immediate attention. Fields had been burned across multiple kingdoms. Villages stood empty, their populations fled or dead. Trade routes had been disrupted for months. The royal treasury was empty and debt-ridden. The infrastructure of governance, tax collectors, magistrates, road wardens had been depleted by war casualties and neglect. Simply feeding the major cities became a challenge when the agricultural heartlands had been devastated. The strategic priorities of rebuilding were clear enough: restore agricultural production, re-establish trade, rebuild the administrative capacity to collect taxes and enforce laws. But executing these priorities required resources the realm did not have. The solution was loans from the Iron Bank of Braavos and the great merchant houses of the free cities. These loans came with interest and conditions, binding the Iron Throne to foreign creditors for decades. It was necessary, but costly. A portion of every future tax collection would flow eastward across the narrow sea, paying for the war long after its battles were forgotten. The political marginalization of women after the dance was one of its most lasting consequences. Rhaenyra had been the realm's greatest example of a woman claiming power in her own right, and she had failed catastrophically. Whether her failure was due to being a woman, or due to the impossible situation her father had created, or due to her own mistakes, became irrelevant. What mattered was the perception a woman had claimed the throne, and the result had been devastating civil war. The lesson drawn, whether fair or not, was that women could not rule, should not rule, must not be allowed to rule, lest the catastrophe repeat itself. The political decision to emphasize male primogeniture going forward was formalized in law and custom. The precedent of the Great Council of 101, which had seemed ambiguous before the dance, became absolute afterward. Sons inherited before, daughters, always, without exception. This was declared the law of the land, the foundation of succession, the principle that would prevent future disputes. Women might hold power as regents for young sons, or as advisors to husbands or brothers, but they would not inherit in their own right, would not rule as queens regnant, would not be allowed to create the conditions for another dance. Was this fair? Of course not. It punished all women for Rhaenyra's failures, ignored the complexity of what had actually happened, codified male supremacy based on a single example. But fairness mattered less than stability. The realm had been devastated by a succession crisis that, whatever its deeper causes, had manifested as a conflict between a female heir and male claimants. The solution, in the minds of those who crafted the peace, was to ensure that situation never arose again. Eliminate female succession, and you eliminate one potential source of civil war. The logic was ruthless, but internally consistent. The political lesson learned extended beyond succession. The dance had demonstrated that civil war was more costly than any succession dispute. Whatever benefits came from having the right person on the throne were vastly outweighed by the devastation of fighting over it. This changed the political calculus fundamentally. Future generations of Targaryens would remember the dance as a cautionary tale, a warning about what happened when family turned on family, when dragons fought dragons, when the realm divided against itself. This lesson held for over a century and a half. Targaryen successions after the dance were carefully managed to avoid ambiguity. When disputes arose, they were resolved through negotiation or great councils, not through war. The memory of the dance hung over every succession crisis, every potential dispute, every moment when claims might conflict. It worked. The Targaryens avoided another civil war for generations, but it also made them cautious, conservative, unwilling to adapt or evolve. and that conservatism would eventually contribute to their downfall when Robert's rebellion finally came. The weakened position of House Targaryen without dragon superiority became apparent immediately after the peace. The dragons had made them special, had made their rule seem inevitable, and their power unquestionable. Without dragons, they were simply another great house, wealthier and more prestigious than most, certainly, but no longer fundamentally superior in kind. They could be challenged. They could be overthrown. They could die just like other men, without dragonfire to protect them or enforce their will. The Targaryens tried to breed dragons again, tried to recover what had been lost. They succeeded to some degree. Dragons hatched, dragons grew, dragons served the crown for another century and a half. But they were never again what they had been before the dance. They were smaller, sicker, more prone to deformity and death. The great dragons of the conquest era, the massive beasts that could melt castles and terrorize armies, were gone. What remained were shadows of former glory, sufficient perhaps to maintain prestige but inadequate to enforce absolute supremacy. The peace that emerged from the dance was therefore a peace of exhausted equals rather than a peace imposed by overwhelming force. The Targaryens ruled because the great houses accepted their rule, not because those houses were terrified of dragonfire. This made governance more difficult, but also more stable in some ways. The king had to negotiate, had to maintain alliances, had to govern with some attention to the needs and desires of his subjects. Tyranny became more difficult when the tyrant could be killed by a dozen knights rather than requiring an army to challenge a dragon. Yet we must ask, was the peace worth the cost? 20,000 words cannot capture the full horror of what the dance destroyed. Whole villages had been burned. Thousands of small folk had died from violence or starvation. Noble houses had been extinguished. The dragons, those magnificent creatures, had been reduced from dozens to a handful. The Targaryen dynasty had been crippled. The realm's economy had been devastated. A generation had been traumatized. And for what? So that Aegon III, a broken boy who had never wanted the throne, could sit upon it and reign over ruins. The peace was necessary without it. The fighting would have continued until nothing remained. But it was not glorious. It was not triumph. It was not even really justice. It was compromise forced by exhaustion, held together by strategic marriages and political calculation, built on the graves of thousands and the burned corpses of dragons. It worked because there was no alternative, because continuing the war had become impossible, because even the most committed partisans recognized that they were destroying what they claimed to be fighting for. The hour of the wolf passed. The executions were carried out. The marriages were arranged. The new king was crowned. The regency began its work. The realm started the long, painful process of rebuilding. And above King's Landing, the Iron Throne stood unchanged, uncomfortable, dangerous, built from the swords of defeated enemies. It had survived the dance. The question was whether the dynasty that had created it could do the same. Stand back from the immediate aftermath, from the negotiations and compromises and political maneuvering, and consider what the Dance of the Dragons changed fundamentally about Westeros. The war lasted less than 3 years, but its consequences echoed across centuries. It was a pivot point in history, the moment when one era ended and another began, when the assumptions that had governed the realm for generations shattered and new patterns emerged from the wreckage. The most immediate and obvious change was the permanent shift in the balance of power after the dragons died. For nearly 3 centuries, the Targaryens had ruled through dragon superiority. They did not need the largest armies or the most castles or even the enthusiastic support of their subjects. They needed dragons, and dragons made all other considerations secondary. A lord might command 10,000 men, but what were 10,000 men against a creature that could burn castles and incinerate armies? This imbalance had made Targaryen rule stable in a way that conventional medieval monarchy could never be. Rebellion was not just difficult but suicidal. The dance changed that calculus irrevocably. The dragons died, not all at once but steadily, through combat and catastrophe and the simple attrition of a civil war fought with the ultimate weapons. By the war's end, only 4 dragons remained. Vhagar and Carax is dead at the God's Eye. Most of the capital's dragons killed in the dragon pit. The battle dragons fallen in combat across the realm. Those that survived were young, small, traumatized by the violence they had witnessed and participated in. The age of great dragons, of beasts large enough to melt stone and terrorize kingdoms, was over. Observe what this meant for the great houses of Westeros. The Starks in the north, the Arryns in the Vale, the Lannisters in the west, the Tyrells in the Reach. These houses had bent the knee to the Targaryens because resistance meant death by dragonfire. But what if dragonfire became manageable? What if dragons could be killed by coordinated military action, as the Dragon Pit mob had demonstrated? What if dragons were small enough that a well-prepared defense might survive their attacks? Suddenly the great houses gained relative strength. They were diminished by the war, certainly, but the Targaryens were diminished far more. The gap between the Iron Throne and the great houses narrowed dramatically. This created a strategic vulnerability that would define Targaryen rule for the next century and a half. The dynasty no longer ruled through overwhelming force but through political skill, through the maintenance of alliances, through the careful balancing of competing interests among the great houses. This was not necessarily worse than the previous system. Many kings proved quite capable of this kind of governance, but it was fundamentally different and fundamentally more fragile. A Targaryen king now had to worry about combinations of houses rising against him. He had to consider the political implications of his decisions. He could be challenged, opposed, even overthrown if he governed badly enough. The political evolution toward more conventional medieval monarchy was gradual but inexorable. Before the dance, Targaryen kings had ruled as something close to absolute monarchs. Their word was law because they had the power to enforce their will against any opposition. After the dance, they ruled more like the kings of European history, powerful, but not omnipotent, dependent on the nobility's cooperation, vulnerable to rebellion if they pushed too hard. The institutions of governance became more important because the king could no longer simply intimidate everyone into compliance. The small council, the regional wardens, the complex web of oaths and obligations, these mattered now in ways they had not before. The lessons later Targaryens drew from the dance's mistakes were both obvious and subtle. The obvious lesson was about succession. Never again would they allow ambiguity about who should inherit. The principle of male primogeniture became absolute law. When disputes arose, great councils were called to resolve them before they could escalate into violence. The Targaryens became obsessed with clear succession planning, with avoiding the exact situation Viserys had created through his indecision and his inability to confront unpleasant truths. But the subtle lesson was about family unity. The dance had been fratricidal Targaryen fighting Targaryen, with all the realm's other conflicts mere fushu to that central struggle. Future generations understood that the dynasty's survival depended on preventing such divisions. They emphasized family loyalty, the importance of blood ties, the necessity of presenting a united front to the realm. When conflicts arose within the royal family, they were to be resolved privately, behind closed doors, where they could not become focal points for broader rebellion. This worked. After a fashion, the Targaryens avoided another civil war for over 150 years. They managed successions, diffused disputes, maintained a facade of unity even when internal tensions ran high. The memory of the dance served as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when family solidarity broke down. Every time a Targaryen prince grew ambitious or a succession question arose, someone would invoke the dance, and that memory was usually sufficient to impose restraint. Yet this lesson also had costs. The obsessive focus on preventing another dance made the Targaryens conservative, resistant to change, unwilling to adapt to evolving circumstances. They became trapped by their own history, always fighting the last war, always preventing the last catastrophe, sometimes missing the new threats emerging around them. Their caution about succession prevented civil war, but also prevented necessary reforms. Their emphasis on family unity sometimes covered up problems that should have been addressed. The dance's shadow was both protective and constraining. How the memory influenced future great councils and successions is evident in the records. When succession questions arose, the dance was invoked constantly. "Remember what happened last time" became a powerful argument for accepting compromise, for yielding gracefully, for prioritizing stability over strict legal right. The Great Council of 233 after conquest, called to resolve another disputed succession, explicitly referenced the dance as the catastrophe to be avoided at all costs. The assembled lords chose stability over other considerations because the alternative was too horrible to contemplate. The strategic error of the dance, visible only in hindsight, was that it was unnecessary. Both sides had legitimate arguments. Both sides could have been accommodated through creative constitutional arrangements, through power sharing, through clear succession laws established before the crisis erupted. Instead, they chose war because war seemed winnable, because compromise seemed weak, because each side believed its claim was not just strong, but absolute. The result was mutual destruction that benefited no one and weakened the dynasty that both sides claimed to be fighting for. This is perhaps the most painful lesson of the dance. It demonstrates how rational actors, making locally reasonable decisions, can produce catastrophic collective outcomes. No single decision was obviously insane. Aegon's supporters had legitimate arguments for his succession. Rhaenyra had legitimate arguments for hers. Once conflict began, each military campaign had strategic logic behind it. Each escalation seemed necessary in response to the other side's actions. Yet the accumulated result was devastation far exceeding any possible benefit from victory. This is how wars become worse than anyone imagined, not through evil or madness, but through the logic of conflict itself, the momentum of violence, the inability to step back and recognize that winning has become indistinguishable from losing. The economic recovery took decades. The immediate post-war period saw famine as agricultural production remained disrupted. The population had declined through war deaths, displacement, and the famines that followed. Whole regions needed rebuilding, villages reconstructed, fields cleared and replanted, roads repaired, bridges rebuilt. The Iron Throne borrowed heavily from foreign banks to finance this recovery, and those debts burdened the realm for generations. The dance had cost not just the immediate expenses of warfare, but the productive capacity lost through destruction, the trade disrupted, the investments unmade because resources had been consumed by conflict. Consider how long it took the realm to heal. A generation grew up knowing only stories of the prosperity before the dance. They inherited a poorer kingdom, a diminished dynasty, a realm where dragons were rare and small rather than common and magnificent. The great castles and cities were eventually repaired, but the confidence was harder to restore. The sense that Targaryen rule was inevitable, that the dragons made them untouchable, that the realm would endure forever under their governance, these beliefs had been shattered and could never be fully reconstructed. The political changes in how the small council and the king's justice operated reflected this new reality. Before the dance, the small council had been advisory. The king listened or did not as he pleased, secure in the knowledge that his dragons enforced his will. After the dance, the small council became more powerful because the king needed their expertise, their connections to the great houses, their ability to govern a realm that could no longer be ruled by intimidation alone. The hand of the king became genuinely crucial rather than merely influential. The master of coin had to balance budgets that actually mattered now, that the treasury could not simply extract whatever it needed through threats. The master of laws had to maintain justice through law rather than fear. The strategic importance of the dance to Robert's rebellion, nearly 2 centuries later, cannot be overstated. The dance established the precedent that Targaryen rule was not inevitable, that dragons could die, that the dynasty could be challenged and defeated. When Robert Baratheon rose in rebellion, when he killed Prince Rhaegar at the Trident, when he claimed the Iron Throne for himself, he was following a pattern the dance had established. The dance showed that Targaryens were not gods but men, that their power was contingent rather than absolute, that their dragons were vulnerable to coordinated resistance. More subtly, the dance changed how the realm thought about legitimacy and succession. Before the dance, legitimacy flowed from dragon-backed conquest and Targaryen blood. After the dance, legitimacy became more complex. It required the acceptance of the great houses, the support of key institutions, the appearance of governing justly and effectively. This made it possible to imagine non-Targaryen rule in a way that had been impossible before. If legitimacy was about governance rather than bloodline and dragons, then perhaps another house could govern. Perhaps the Targaryens could be replaced. The dance did not make Robert's rebellion inevitable, but it made it thinkable, and that was the first step toward making it real. How the Targaryen dynasty's decline began with this internal conflict is a matter of tracing cause and effect across generations. The immediate aftermath saw a weakened dynasty ruling over a devastated realm. The following century saw gradual recovery, but never a return to the certainty and dominance of the pre-dance era. The dragons continued to diminish smaller, sicklier, dying younger, until the last one perished during the reign of Aegon III himself, the boy king who had witnessed so much horror. Without dragons, the Targaryens were vulnerable in ways they had never been before. The political calculus that made their eventual overthrow possible was built on the foundations the dance created. The great houses had learned that Targaryens could be fought and beaten. The common people had learned that dragons could die, and that Targaryen rule brought no guarantee of peace or prosperity. The nobility had learned that clear succession law and limited royal power served their interests better than Targaryen absolutism. When the Mad King Aerys began burning people alive, when he demanded Jon Arryn execute his wards, when his madness threatened the realm's stability, these lessons from the dance informed the response. Rebellion became possible because the dance had shown it could work. The enduring strategic lesson power, divided against itself cannot stand, seems almost painfully obvious with hindsight. Yet every generation must learn it anew, because the temptation to believe otherwise is powerful. Aegon and Rhaenyra both believed they could win a civil war and emerge stronger. They were both wrong. The only winner in their conflict was entropy, chaos, the forces that tear civilizations apart. They destroyed what they fought for, and the destruction weakened their dynasty permanently. This lesson extends beyond Westeros, beyond the Targaryens, beyond even the genre of fantasy. It speaks to something fundamental about power and conflict. Organizations, nations, families, institutions, when they turn their strength inward, when they fight themselves, they create wounds that heal slowly, if at all. The Dance of the Dragons was many things: a succession crisis, a civil war, a family tragedy, a military campaign. But fundamentally, it was a demonstration of how power can destroy itself, how strength improperly directed becomes weakness, how winning can mean losing everything that made victory worthwhile. The dragons that conquered Westeros are gone now, vanished into history and legend. The Targaryens who rode them eventually fell, overthrown by the very forces the dance had unleashed. The Iron Throne remains that uncomfortable seat of melted swords, but it is held by other hands, other dynasties, other claimants. The dance changed Westeros irrevocably, shifted the course of history, demonstrated truths about power and conflict that remain relevant long after the last dragon died. Stand now in the throne room at King's Landing, beneath the high windows that let in shafts of dusty sunlight. Look upon the Iron Throne and consider what it represents, not just power, but its fragility, not just strength, but its limits, not just conquest, but its costs. The dance of the dragons is written into that throne, in every melted sword, in every sharp edge, in every uncomfortable angle. It is a reminder, a warning, a lesson carved in metal and sealed with blood. The realm survived the dance, barely. The Targaryens survived the dance, for a time, but survival is not the same as victory, and continuation is not the same as flourishing. The dance took something from Westeros that could never be fully recovered, the sense of permanence, the certainty of Targaryen rule. The dragons themselves, what remained was a more fragile realm, a more human dynasty, a world where power had to be earned and maintained, rather than simply claimed through dragonfire and blood. This is what the dance teaches us, if we have wisdom to learn, that power is not eternal, that even dragons can die, that civil war destroys victors and vanquished alike, that some contests have no winners, only survivors, that the weapons which build kingdoms can tear them apart, that fire and blood, however magnificent, however terrible, however awe-inspiring, ultimately consume everything they touch, including those who wield them. The Dance of the Dragons ended with the coronation of a traumatized boy king and the death of the last great dragons. It ended with compromises that satisfied no one and a peace built on exhaustion rather than reconciliation. It ended with a realm diminished and a dynasty weakened, and a lesson written in ashes that future generations would read or ignore at their peril. The dragons danced, and in their dance they destroyed the sky itself. What remains are the stories, the warnings, the knowledge bought at terrible cost that some wars should never be fought, that some powers should never be divided, that some prices are too high to pay even for victory. The Iron Throne stands. The dance is over, the dragons are gone, and the realm lives on, scarred and changed, carrying forward the lessons of what happened when fire turned against fire, when blood betrayed blood, when power divided against itself and nearly destroyed everything it touched.